Obviously, we're honored to have Dr. Collins with us. He gave a great talk yesterday, attended by many students and members of the medical community. And I want to thank again Congressman Pete Sessions for introducing us to Dr. Collins and encouraging him to accept our invitation. Obviously, he receives many to do things just like this, and we're pleased that he could be a part of our commencement ceremony. Many of you know him, as I do, from his books and other writings on his personal faith in God as the foundation of his confidence in the work in the discoveries through the scientific method. He's a great scientist and a great communicator on behalf of the science community, as well as those who believe that all things throughout the world are united in a very significant way. Would you join me in bringing to the podium for his commencement address, Dr. Francis Collins.
Thank you, President Turner. It's an honor to join all of you receiving the bachelor's degree today. And a special thank you to Professor Vogel for her hosting of my visit here. We had a wonderful afternoon symposium yesterday talking about biomedical research. Thanks also to Provost Curl for his leadership here and the opportunity to get to know many of the faculty here in my brief stay. And I particularly want to give a shout out to Congressman Pete Sessions, who is sitting right up there, for extending this invitation and giving me a chance to be here, and also to thank him for his strong and sustained support for biomedical research. In the role that he plays as chairman of the House Rules Committee, he's in a position to have a great deal of influence on the track that our nation takes, and he has been consistently on the right side of supporting the idea that medical research is not just a cost to the government, it's an investment in our future, the future of our nation, our nation's health, our economy, all of those things. So thank you, Congressman Sessions. And congratulations, Mustangs in the class of 17. You did it. All right. I had a privilege of meeting with 3 of the Ph.D. graduates yesterday and getting a sense of their energy, their vision, their enthusiasm, their camaraderie. This is clearly a place where people make friends and enjoy those experiences that don't just happen as you're having all kinds of things poured into your head in the classroom. You also have learned how to network, and I don't mean necessarily using Facebook. You know exactly what the joys can be of being part of a university community where ideas are freely shared and debated, and I appreciated what the President said a few minutes ago about this being a campus where that kind of civil discourse is not just occasionally happening, it is part of the fabric of this institution. May it ever be so. And I also noticed yesterday and again today about the interdisciplinary approach that this university takes, and I want to commend you for that. The way things are going, whether it's in science or the humanities, the boundaries that sometimes have gotten in our way in terms of learning from each other and designing projects are falling away, and those boundaries should fall away. And certainly in the health sciences, the people I work with might be computer scientists, they might be physicians, they might be neuroscientists, they might be physiologists, they might be engineers, lots of them. And that's what makes it so much fun right now, to be able to knock down boundaries with lots of people on your team who maybe speak a little bit of a different scientific language, but together, there are things we can do we never could have done alone. And that's the way science is going, and I was delighted to see this university emphasizing that in a very concrete and palpable way. So what am I doing here? Why is this an appropriate person to bring in front of you? Well, you can decide later if there was a good answer to that or not. In giving a commencement address, of course, one kind of has to think back upon one's own experience. And I have to say that when I was graduating from the University of Virginia with a bachelor's degree in chemistry in 1970, I just made myself younger than I am. I don't remember what the commencement speaker said. So this is a little sobering. And I asked if I could use PowerPoints, and they said, no, that we just don't do that. So some of my usual tricks are not available. But it does make me reflect a bit on what I was thinking at that point, sitting in the seats where many of you are here today. In 1970, graduating from UVA as a chemistry major, I was convinced that my life was going to be as an academic physical chemist, because that's what I had learned to love. And I went off and got a Ph.D. in physical chemistry, doing quantum mechanics research. But somewhere I ran into biology, which I kind of considered was way too messy. And maybe I was right about that. But it became increasingly intriguing to have a chance to work in a science where a lot of things seemed to be happening, and where also there was a chance for my love of science to connect up with something that was more concrete in terms of human impact. So in a somewhat major crisis of what my career path would be, I completely blew up the plan and went to medical school. Not something I'd really thought of until about then. Why those good folks at the admissions committee at the University of North Carolina accepted this as a good reason to come to their medical school is a matter of some debate, but they did. And I loved it from the beginning, and because here was science, but it was also about people. And I was particularly attracted to the field of genetics, because here was a part of medicine that was digital. There was math here. You could do stuff with DNA, and that's what I've enjoyed doing ever since. But what to do? I decided, okay, research is still calling to me, and ultimately, after a lot of more years of training, ended up as a faculty member at the University of Michigan, teaching medical students, taking care of patients, and doing research at a really interesting time where we were beginning to develop methods to find the causes of human illnesses that had been obscure. And that was an amazing ride. And then I got this phone call in 1992 saying, we need somebody to come and lead the Human Genome Project. Would you be interested? And I thought that sounded like something to talk about, because after all, the Human Genome Project, this audacious idea of reading out all 3 billion letters of the human DNA instruction book, if it worked, was going to be utterly transformative. But most people at that point thought it wasn't going to work. So do you want to join on to an effort that might be doomed? And what's more, I discovered, you have to become a federal employee to do this. You got to go to NIH, and you got to run a center. So I talked to my mom. It's what you should do, right? And she said, you know, that sounds like a really interesting job, and it could be phenomenal if it succeeds, and, you know, I want you to follow your dreams. But there's one thing I hope none of my 4 sons would ever become, and that's a federal employee. Well, I think it's the only time I ever disobeyed my mom, because it just seemed like, okay, this has got to be something to try. And I'm so glad I had that opportunity. And over the next 13 years, as we read out those letters of the human DNA sequence, bit by bit, it became more and more clear that this could actually succeed, and we could actually do this, and what's more, we could do a lot of good by giving all the data away, and that's what the Human Genome Project decided to do every 24 hours, posting it up on the internet for anybody who could try to figure out how to make the use of this remarkable DNA instruction book that we're all born with, and particularly, how could we make medical advances? So that was an amazing experience, to be part of a group of 2,400 scientists in 6 countries, all working together to achieve these goals. And it was my job to be the project manager and make sure that we did it right. And then we did it. And then there were other things to try to do to figure out how to read this book. We had the letters in front of us, but written in a funny language with just those 4 letters, A, C, G, and T. And we were just beginning readers, and we had to learn what the syntax was. And so the next 5 years I spent trying to help design other projects to do that. And then I got restless and decided, okay, enough of government service, I'm going to do something else. Well, that didn't last very long. 9 months later, I got called back to serve as the director of the National Institutes of Health, and was incredibly privileged to be given that opportunity. And that was August of 2009 when I took on that role. And I kind of thought that role would be something that I would do perhaps for the next 7 or 8 years, because The director of the NIH is appointed by the president, and historically, there's always been a turnover of directorships when there's a new president. So I sent in my letter of resignation, as all the other appointees did, and expected on January 20th that I would have a different job. On January 18th, I got an email that said, very simply, very directly, your resignation letter has been rejected. Some have speculated it must have been the grammar, or maybe I had a misspelled word or something, but at any rate, I was asked, and I still am, able to continue in this role as director of the largest supporter of biomedical research in the world, the National Institutes of Health, which we think of as the National Institutes of Hope. And I get to preside over this amazing engine of discovery at a time of unbelievable scientific promise. We talked about some of these scientific opportunities yesterday at the symposium. Neuroscience is just at an amazing place. We are going to figure out how the human brain works in the next 10 years, not just in a general way, but in a very specific way. How do those circuits in your brain do what they're doing right now? How do you lay down a memory and retrieve it? We're going to figure that out. And the consequences of that for understanding diseases like autism and schizophrenia and Alzheimer's disease are going to be enormous. And to be part of that, all of you graduates who are thinking about going into some form of biomedical science, you've arrived at the right moment. Regenerative medicine, the ability to figure out how to take some of your cells and convince them to be things you might need. Maybe we won't need heart transplants and kidney transplants and liver transplants in another 10 years because you can make your own by the amazing things that are happening in regenerative medicine. And wouldn't that be great? And this whole field of genomics, which rose up out of the Human Genome Project's initial efforts and has now become an opportunity to take apart the causes of illness across many different kinds of categories, and puts us in a position where all of us can pretty soon be able to take advantage of that in planning our own healthcare maintenance and managing any illnesses that come along, moving away from one-size-fits-all medicine to something that's about the individual, which we now call precision medicine. That's becoming very much a reality. And later this year, if you're interested in becoming part of a national experiment and how to use that information in the best possible way, you can sign up for a program called All of Us. Look that up on the web. And All of Us will ask 1 million Americans to take part in a long-term study of how studies of environment and inheritance can teach us what really are the causes of illness and what to do about it. And that's something we've never had the boldness to try before, and we're going to do it, and we're going to see what we can learn, and you can be part of it. So all you graduates and all you parents and grandparents, come on. Watch for this long about the fall of this year. Okay, well, enough about sort of how I got here, and you can again decide whether it was appropriate, but it is a commencement address, right? So I'm supposed to give you some messages, and it's like a sermon, so you can only have 3 points. I have learned that. So here we go. Here are my 3 points that I want to give you to the graduates, and some of them are a little more serious, because this is a time where I think we ought to stop for a minute and reflect where you've been and where you're going. First of all, this isn't particularly serious, but it's something to pay attention to. You all are going to need to be prepared for dramatic change going forward. Whatever the field is that you are in, you're not going to be able to quite imagine what it looks like in 10 or 20 years. I promise you that. And that's certainly true in science and technology. It's going to be true in healthcare. It needs to be, because our healthcare system is clearly far from optimum at the moment. I just mentioned the idea of integrating environmental and genetic information into your own health maintenance. All of you will have the chance to do that. I would predict that virtually everybody in this room will have their genome sequenced sometime in the next 10 or 20 years, and you'll find that pretty interesting and useful, because it already has dropped in cost to less than $1,000, and 5 years from now, maybe it'll be $100, so, why not? But let's be sure we use it wisely, and let's be sure that your information is yours and it's secure. So be prepared for dramatic change. Don't fight it off. Embrace it. Doors are going to open for you that you didn't expect, like that one was when I got called to become a federal employee and lead the Genome Project. And think hard when that happens. Is that really my next calling? Other doors that you were counting on are going to close that you didn't expect. And those can be painful and hurtful, but they always offer an opportunity. So first point, be prepared for that dramatic change. Second point, which I just sort of alluded to, your path is not always going to be smooth. You already know that. Many of you have already faced some pretty tough bumps in the road to get here, but you got here. And that's a credit to who you are, your intelligence, your drive, your determination. But life doesn't owe you necessarily a smooth path from here on, and it will undoubtedly lead you into places that you had wished would not happen. And it would be good to think right here today, are you prepared for that? Are you in a place where you have the strength and the sense of a foundation to be able to deal with that? That certainly happened to all of us. It's happened to me. As a scientist, the darkest hour in my scientific career was 20 years ago, when it was revealed that a graduate student in my own laboratory, an incredibly talented young man, had actually been fabricating data. He knew what the answer ought to be to an experiment, and when it didn't quite work, he made it look like it did. And this had gone on for many months without realization by me or anybody else around him, and resulted in the need for a very public disclosure, a front-page story in the New York Times, a retraction of multiple papers that had data in it that we could not verify. For a scientist to be in the midst of a circumstance where you're responsible for something that was not true, and not true just because you misinterpreted the data, but because you made it up, is about the lowest point that one can have. And that, for me, was a learning experience about how never to be so confident in yourself that you're really sure of anything around you. You have to be a skeptic, but you also have to take responsibility. And we did, and that led to, I think, an opportunity to educate a lot of other scientists about how easy it is for these things to happen. And I was very public about it at the time, as I'm now being with you. Tragedies are going to happen in your life. As a scientist who works on some diseases that are particularly likely to take the lives of those affected, those tragedies happen all too often. My lab works on this rare form of premature aging called progeria. These kids age at about 7 times the normal rate. They're extremely rare, these conditions. There's only a few dozen kids alive right now in the United States who have this disease, and we've studied them closely and come up with a strategy for treatment after discovering the genetic cause. But I confess, I get attached to these kids. Got particularly attached to one named Sam Burns, who was the subject of an HBO special called Life According to Sam. At the age of 16, knowing that the clock was really running out on him, he told the world how to live their lives. Can you imagine that? The courage of that, the vision of that. And it was my determined goal that we would find a treatment for that disease to save Sam. Sam died last year. I am determined we will find a cure for the next Sam and the one after that. But those tragedies are going to be part of everyone's life. And again, what do you do then? Do you collapse? Do you say, oh, the heck with it, I'll do something else? Or does it increase your determination to work harder? So that's second point. Your path will not be smooth. Be ready for that. Third point. Remember I said 3, so you're almost home. But this one's a little longer and more complicated. Clarify, all of you, your definition of success. What is that? By being here as a graduate of SMU, you've already demonstrated success. You have remarkable intelligence, dedication. You've succeeded. But succeed at what? If you can find time to read one book in the next month, pick up the book by David Brooks called The Road to Character. It's very thought-provoking. And he kind of calls out our current culture in a way that I think we needed to pay attention to. That what is it that we are basically attaching ourselves to as far as the definition of success? It seems to be about accomplishments, and maybe it ought to be about character. He has this provocative way of describing that. Are you spending your time on what you might call resume virtues, or are you spending your time on what might be called eulogy virtues? What people will say about you in that ultimate day, where in a few words they're trying to capture who you were and what you did to make the world a better place. Resume virtues or eulogy virtues? I fear our focus on resumes can be pretty overpowering in our current, very competitive American culture. And we need to stop and think about that, and I hope you'll think about that right now. Your resume won't help you handling those failures and tragedies that I talked about a minute ago. Your resume won't help you with relationships, whether they're romantic relationships or with your family or with your friends. Those relationships will count a lot when that eulogy is spoken, but you won't put them on your CV. And your resume virtues may distract you from deep thinking about life's purpose and meaning, which is really what one needs if you're going to build character. I know SMU cares deeply about this issue, about developing character, and it's wonderful to be here at this university to give this message, because I know that you have heard it before, but maybe in a slightly different way. If it's character, though, that you and we all seek as a definition of success, then what is your true north? Character has to be built on some foundation. What's your worldview? Now, let me say, Friedrich Nietzsche is not my favorite philosopher, but he had it right when he wrote in a single sentence, listen to this, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." Let me say that again. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. A sentence that was comforting to Viktor Frankl when he suffered in the concentration camps at the end of World War II. He who has a why to live, he had that, can bear almost any how. How am I going to get through this? So what is your why? You're going to have a lot of hows. You've had some already. But what is that why that enables you to figure out how to deal with whatever comes along? I confess, I wasn't thinking about that in 1970 as a graduate. I was in love with quantum mechanics. And frankly, I was in love with second-order differential equations. And I was devoted to reductionist thinking. Having had very little exposure as I was growing up to what faith means, I was an agnostic bordering rather closely to atheism. I didn't know the term then, but perhaps all of you well-educated SMU graduates do, but I was becoming an adherent of what you would call metaphysical naturalism, believing that there was no truth that could not be discovered by science. That was it. A materialist view taken to the extreme. But that was where I was. As I said, I went on and did this Ph.D. in quantum mechanics, but then discovered biology and ended up in medical school. And there, my metaphysical naturalism started to fall apart. As I dealt daily with death and dying of good North Carolina people, my perspective felt very cold and brittle and unsatisfying. And one of my patients, an elderly woman with advanced heart disease, shared her faith with me one day, making me squirm a bit, and then turned and asked me directly, "Doctor, you haven't said anything. What do you believe?" And that moment still burned into my brain. I realized I don't have an answer to this. I'm a scientist. I'm supposed to make decisions about something that are really important based on looking at the evidence, and I've never actually considered whether there might be evidence for and against faith. Well, that was unsettling, and I was at the same time beset by how questions. How can I deal with my own failures to heal the sick? How can I get through this long night on call? How can I feel so lonely when I'm never alone? How can I be forgiven when I'm such an imperfect husband and father? How can I actually find something you'd call peace and joy? How can I try to make the world a better place? How can I figure out whether there is a God? And if so, whether that God cares about me? Metaphysical naturalism had no help to provide because that was a why that couldn't address those hows. But I had a fearful sense that as a scientist, any alternatives beyond a strictly materialist worldview that I might consider would lead to intellectual suicide, because that was the message that I'd gotten from a lot of my non-believing friends. But I had to explore this. I could not remember that question from my patient saying, "Doctor, what do you believe?" without having a better answer. So in some expectation that that exploration would simply further strengthen my atheism, I began a 2-year exploration to try to find out really what is the truth here and what is the evidence. And I was shocked to find out that in fact the evidence in favor of the existence of God is a lot more compelling than the evidence against. I did not realize that. And that from a purely rational perspective, the position of strict atheism is the least defensible. To say that I know so much that I can exclude the possibility of God has to be the ultimate hubris for a human being to be able to say. And so, much aided by a pastor, by a bunch of professors who were willing to talk about their own path, and particularly by the writings of one C.S. Lewis, I found a path towards a richly satisfying faith, a faith in a God of reason and unimaginable intelligence, not a God of ignorance and superstition at all, which is what I had thought. Again, remember, I had no real training as a child about all this. I had many misconceptions. No, I discovered a creator God who helped me to see that science could actually be a form of worship. A God who could be found in the laboratory, not just in the cathedral. A God who knew my need for forgiveness and gave it freely in that unimaginable sacrifice on the cross. But most of all, a God of love, providing the ultimate answer to the why that I was seeking answers for. So I realize this description of a scientist's spiritual journey may make absolutely no sense to some of you, but most of you will find the occasion, the need to make such a journey sometime. Many of you have already done so. For others, it lies ahead, or you're in the middle of it. Maybe we should all be in the middle of it for their whole life experience. Some of you will put it off and cram for exams at the end of life. But, don't wait too long. God might give you a pop quiz. But maybe this all sounds a little philosophical, so let me wind this up with a story about hows and whys. It was 1989. I was on the faculty at the University of Michigan. I was interested in global health, and I had a friend who had done a lot of mission work in West Africa, and he lined me up to go do a 2-week rotation in a mission hospital in the Delta region of Nigeria, in a little village called Eku. And I was excited about it, but to be honest, I was kind of thinking about this as a resume virtue. Yeah, the well-trained Western physician goes to Nigeria and everything changes because he's so knowledgeable and so smart. That's not how it worked. So I got there, I realized my Western training wasn't all that helpful. I was seeing diseases that had only been words on a page before. The laboratory services in this little hospital were pretty non-existent. About all that I had was a physical diagnosis and a history, and many of the times I came up empty. I had to see 60 patients every afternoon in the clinic. The hospital was full to overflowing with people sleeping on the floor because there weren't enough beds. It was exhausting and it was discouraging because it seemed like whatever I could do was immediately countered by a public health system that was utterly broken. And I might maybe temporarily help somebody who would go back to a system of dirty water, poor nutrition, and all manner of other infectious diseases, and sooner or later something bad would happen anyhow. So I got to a pretty low point after a week. I felt like a failure. I felt discouraged. I asked a lot of how questions. How am I going to get through this? And then one afternoon, a young farmer came into the clinic who was clearly very ill and had been, over the course of just a few days, developing massive swelling of his legs. It was very mysterious what was going on. But by going over his physical exam, it became clear that he probably had a collection of fluid around his heart, what's called a pericardial effusion, most likely caused by tuberculosis. And if something wasn't done about that, he would surely die in a matter of a day or two. And I had never done the procedure that requires sticking a needle directly into the area of the heart to draw that fluid off. And if you go a little too far, you can imagine the consequence. But I was the only person available to try this, so I felt I had to. And by God's grace, it actually worked, and the fluid was drawn off. And when I came to see him the next morning, sitting on the side of his bed, reading his Bible, he looked pretty good. But I still felt this discouragement. He had tuberculosis. Yeah, we had managed the acute problem, but to treat him, to cure him, was going to take a year's worth of medicines. It wasn't clear how they would be available, whether he could take them. So I was still in my gloomy state. And he had some insight as I walked up to his bed. He said, "You know, you seem different than the other doctors around here. have you just recently arrived? I was kind of irritated. I didn't think it was that obvious. And then his insight got even deeper. He said, I have a sense that you're wondering why you came here. Wow, I didn't realize I was that transparent. And then he gave me this incredible gift. He said, I have an answer for you. You came here for one reason, doctor. You came here for me. Even now, all these years later, I get a chill when I think of that moment. What a remarkable experience. Two individuals who could not be more different in their culture, their geography, their ethnicity, their background, than that young man and myself. And he gave me the healing gift, reminding me what this is really all about. It's about love between individuals that makes no sense, that agape love that one tries to give. And when you have the experience of realizing that has happened, it is the sweetest joy. And that reminded me then that I'd had my whole framework mixed up. And now I understood not just the how, but the why. The why was the God of love manifested in this young Nigerian farmer. And I will cling to that every time I start to get mixed up about where the hows and the why should be. But time is passing, and I fear the thought may be creeping into the minds of some of you. The only why I have is why they let this guy go on so long. So let's summarize. That's what you have to do at the end of the sermon, right? First, be prepared for the unexpected, yes. Second, embrace change. Third, be prepared to make the best of those failures. So that's second. They're going to happen. Third, focus on character, not accomplishments, eulogy virtues, not resume virtues. And of course, discover your true north if you don't know it yet. Figure out what that why is. Okay, one more bit of advice, my fourth point in a speech that was supposed to have 3. Don't forget to have some fun. Don't be an Eeyore, at least not all the time. Winston Churchill said, you can't deal with the most serious things in the world unless you also understand the most amusing. Hans Christian Andersen said it a little more simply, enjoy life. There's plenty of time to be dead. But fun is a little bit of a difficult topic to lecture about. So maybe there's another way we could bring this to a much overdue close, which is more of a demonstration, I hope, of what you might also consider would be a little bit of fun. There's a drape over here that looks like it's over a dead body. I'm going to have to see what it really is. Yes, music has a way of ruining all sorts of otherwise dignified experiences. And this is a song for you, graduates, and the faculty may or may not appreciate it, but it's about the student experience. At least much of it is until you get to the last part, and then it's about me. But yes, tongue-in-cheek now, don't anybody get offended. This is what it's like to be a student these days in university somewhere, maybe even in Dallas. I came, I bought the books, I lived in the dorms, followed directions. I worked, I studied hard, made lots of friends that had connections. I crammed, they gave me grades, and may I say, not in a fair way, but more, much more than this, I did it their way. I learned so many things, although I know I'll never use them. The courses that I took were all required. I didn't choose them. You'll find that to survive, it's best to play the doctrinaire way. And so I knuckled down and did it their way. Well, yes, there were times I wondered why I had to cringe when I could fly. I had my doubts, but after all, I clipped my wings and learned to crawl. I learned to bend, and in the end, I did it their way. And now for my verse. But now, my fine young friends, now that I am a full professor, where once I was oppressed, I have now become the cruel oppressor. With me, I hope you'll see the double helix is a highway, and yes, you'll learn it's best to do it my way. Wow, there's more. Well, I'm just a man, what can I do? Open your books, read chapter 2, and if it seems a bit routine, don't talk to me, go see the dean. Just start today, love DNA, and do it my way. Thank you all. Congratulations! Bless you all.